Hmm. Okay. Then with bodhicitta, we'll do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. See, folks. And first of all, just to remind us. So, we're studying in mind and mental factors. We're using the necklace for those of clear awareness, clearly revealing the modes of minds and mental factors. And hopefully, if you all have the text, that's good. If not, Damchu can share it if anybody needs it. Say so. But and then. Also, so we're up to mental factors, right? And we just started last time the beginning of the 5 omnipresent mental factors. The first of which is feeling, which is one of the 5 aggregates. And I thought to make a couple of general comments before we go back to the text. And one is actually, in the previous couple classes we mentioned, in the previous class particularly, and the one before it, we talked a little bit about how the minds and the mental factors have 5 similarities, right? That they have the same object, and there are 2 different lists of the 5 similarities, so they're slightly, from different traditions, but they're very similar. And one of them was the same time. And actually, Damcha, you asked the question last time, I think it was last time, about they're having, because when it says they have the same similar time, right? Then it says they arise, abide, and cease. At the same time. And so you were asking, is that true? That you were asking how, if that is true and how that would work. And I've been thinking about that one. And actually, so yesterday I actually called and had a conversation with Gyume Khenpo Rinpoche about that. Because I was curious what his view was on it. And his view was, quite definitive. And so he's a great scholar. And so I'll just share it. It was kind of an interesting point that he shared. He said he shared a couple of points that I think are worth noting. First he noted that the minds and mental factors in general do exist in the same time. That they arise together, they abide together, and they cease together. But then he made a couple of clarifying points. One was, he used the example we talked, as I brought up, we were using the example of the feeling, right? The mental factor of feeling. And so one point he made is that, while the feeling is omnipresent, so it's always there, right? All the omnipresent mental factors are by definition, always present. But then he made a point, he said, but the feeling can change. So in other words, if you're aware of a certain object, it's not that the feeling stays constant. So in other words, feeling is always there, but feeling can go from neutral to positive, for example, or neutral to negative. So that was one clarification, is that the feeling is always present, but within a certain experience. I gave the example of, I said, if you see someone on the road and at first, you recognize as a person, but then you look more closely and you realize it's somebody you don't like, and then a negative feeling may arise. And he said, well, so first there's a neutral feeling, then there's a negative feeling. But feeling is, the experience of feeling is always there throughout that experience of that person in that example. But the feeling can shift from negative to neutral in that example, or can go from negative to neutral to positive, and so on. So that was one point. And then I gave the example of, when we were chatting, I gave the example, I said, well, let's say you see that person. At first there's a neutral feeling, but then you recognize, oh, this is my enemy and I don't like them. And then the feeling becomes negative or unpleasant. I said, and then it appears to me that then you become angry. You might become angry. A person, then you might become angry. Oh, that's my enemy. Now I'm angry at them. And then anger may arise. And then Rinpoche clarified. So then he clarified. He said, well, there are certain types of, in the list of mental factors, there are the omnipresent mental factors, there are the object ascertaining mental factors, and then anger would be a non-virtuous mental factor, right? One of the mental afflictions. And so he was pointing out, he said, in that example, the omnipresent mental factors arise, abide, and cease with the main mind. The object ascertaining ones also abide, arise, and cease with the main mind, because you're ascertaining an object. But the anger is a different category, right? It's one of the non-virtues, and so he said that one can arise later. So he was making, and so by extension, you can see that the virtues and the non-virtues can arise later. I think by extension that's clear. So that certain mental factors have to be present for always accompany the main mind throughout it. So they arise, they abide, and they cease along with that main mind that's ascertaining a certain object of experience, let's say. But that there are some of the mental factors can arise subsequently. So it depends which category of mental factor it is. And I just want to be sure that was how it seemed to me, but I wasn't confident that was 100% correct. So I double checked it with Kenshin Rinpoche and he clarified that that's the correct interpretation. So there are always mental factors present, and certain ones are present throughout the entire time that there's a main mind, right? But then there the virtues and the non-virtues are examples that can arise subsequent to the arising of the main mind, after you have a certain, a pleasant or unpleasant experience, a feeling, or after you have a certain discernment, right, or discrimination about something, then you can give rise to for example, a virtuous or non-virtuous mental factor. So I just wanted to clarify that point because I thought, it clarifies what this having similar time means. Otherwise, I thought, that could be confusing. Okay. Oh, and actually, I'll clarify one more point related to a question that was raised too. So we were also talking last time about how, so we're up to the aggregate, the mental factor of feeling, which is also, and somebody had asked us, I can't remember who, but somebody had asked, and so we clarified that the mental factor of feeling is identical to the aggregate of feeling, right? In the 5 aggregates, one of the aggregate, right? There's form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness, right? And so feeling is, so that the mental factor of feeling is the same as the aggregate of feeling, right? So it's an important one that was emphasized, right, by the Buddha when he mentioned the 5 aggregates. He chose feeling as one of the 5. And then he also chose the next of the discrimination, we'll call it discernment or discrimination, which is the next of the 5 omnipresent mental factors. He also chose that as an aggregate, right? So he emphasized them in some sense, right? He emphasized these 2 mental factors as particularly important. And then the aggregate of compositional factors would include all the other mental factors, right? They would all be lumped under that category. And there was a special emphasis among those on intention, which is the 3rd of the omnipresent mental factors. So those 3 are kind of emphasized, but 2 of them are actually among the 5 aggregates. And I was sort of contemplating, well, why, of all the mental factors, right, why emphasize those 2 so much? Why did the Buddha himself emphasize those 2 in such a prominent way as to include them in the list of the 5 aggregates? And I've seen the different texts give different reasons for that. So there are various, different scholars have suggested different reasons, but in one commentary, actually Venerable George Chernoff had pointed out that Lama Tsongkhapa about, it kind of raises in some texts those different theories of why the Buddha emphasized them. And then he says that he agrees, or he thinks that Vasubandhu's point is the most cogent, let's say. And so Vasubandhu and Lama Tsongkhapa emphasize this, that he says, because the five aggregates are talking about, or the five contaminated aggregates are talking about the nature of samsara, right? It's the samsaric aggregates. It's how we, it's a samsaric, they're what make up a samsaric being. And then he was saying that, one way of putting it is this, is that the aggregate of feeling, right? Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral feelings for ordinary people, everyday people, is how we compound our suffering, right? In other words, because when we give rise to pleasant feelings, then we generate desire, greed, craving. When we have unpleasant feelings, we give rise to aversion, anger, hatred, despising, and so on. And then when we have neutral feelings, we give rise to indifference, uncaring, and ignorance. And so through the aggregate or the mental factor of feeling, ordinary people compound their suffering in those ways, right? We ordinary people relate to our feelings through those kinds of mental affliction as a way of giving, we give rise to those mental afflictions in reaction to our feelings, and thereby compound our samsara and our suffering. And then he said, scholars who have not discerned the ultimate meaning of reality, they compound their suffering by means of discrimination. So in other words, you can kind of say faulty philosophers discriminate incorrectly about the nature of reality and then compound their suffering with mistaken views. And so Vasubandhu says the reason why the Buddha emphasized those two is they're the way in which ordinary everyday people and philosophers compound the suffering of samsara and continue our misery within samsara. So I just thought that was an interesting point to share, because you might wonder, and I was sort of contemplating it, why is it that of all the mental factors, those two are emphasized? So that's Vasubandhu's point, which Lama Tsongkhapa kind of said, of all the different scholars' positions, Tsongkhapa liked that one the best, and Vasubandhu, of course, is a very respected scholar. So anyway, I just thought to share those two general points. And then Sujata has her hand up.
Thank you, Lauren. That was super fascinating. I'm wondering about the compositional. You said that all the other ones were compositional factors. Does that mean all the other of the omnipresent mental factors, or all of the mental factors, period? Does that make sense?
Yeah, all of the other mental factors, period, would be included under compositional factors. Not so the main mind wouldn't, because that would come under, the main mental consciousness would come under consciousness. But all the other, so like the virtuous mental factors, the non-virtuous mental factors, the changeable mental factors, the object ascertaining mental factors, all those different kinds of mental factors would come under compositional factors.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay. So those were some general points that I just wanted to come back to, so I wouldn't forget to share them, because people had asked about it and I thought more about it and didn't want to leave it in case it was confusing. Yeah. Okay, so then we kind of left off on the very bottom of page 16, where we were talking about the aggregate, or the mental factor. I'll say mental factor, it's both, but a feeling. And so, the beginning point I had already covered, where he kind of brings up this idea that brings up the point that feeling is a fruitional result of karma, right? In other words, that due to our previous karma, we either have pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feelings. Again, which I had pointed out last time, is a wonderful point that he makes, right? Because we don't usually relate to, when we have it, actually, we don't usually think that way, which is part of our problem, isn't it, from a Buddhist perspective? When we have an unpleasant feeling, we usually blame somebody, right? Or we get angry, or we get upset, rather than saying, oh, it's a result of my karma, it's purifying a karma, how wonderful. And then when we give rise to a pleasant feeling, we oftentimes generate craving or desire or greed, or rather than recognizing, oh, that's a result of positive karma, let me do more virtue, and so on. So he was very skillfully pointing that out, and from a practice perspective. But now he goes into, at the bottom of page 16, he says, when feelings are divided, there are three. And then we start to page 17. So now he's going to give a more formal definition of feeling. So he says, and we've already talked about this already today, but he says there are pleasant feelings, suffering or unpleasant feelings, and neutral feelings. Sometimes that one, yeah, so pleasant feelings is usual, and then suffering or unpleasant feelings, you could say. And then neutral feelings that are neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And then he quotes Vasubandhu, and he quotes, I've mentioned this before, he quotes this text by Vasubandhu, a discussion of the five aggregates, a number of times, which is translated in English along with a commentary to it by Srimati, by Art Engel. So Tsongkhapa quotes that, or rather, Kachin Yeshe Gelsen quotes that. So he says, furthermore, it has been said in the discussion of the five aggregates by Vasubandhu. So the question is raised, what is feeling? Then he says, response, it is the three types of experience: pleasant, suffering, and that which is neither suffering nor pleasant. And then he goes into further explanation. He says, pleasant feeling is that which, when it ceases, you wish to meet with again. One point is, I'll just mention here, is there are other texts, this is a small detail, but you'll see that it doesn't, they're not contradictory. Some texts say a pleasant feeling is that, it don't say when it ceases you wish to meet it again. It says a pleasant feeling is that which you wish to not be parted from. So, the not be parted from would emphasize while it's happening, you don't want it to, you grasp at it and don't want to lose it. Or some texts like this one by Vasubandhu say, and Kachin Yeshe Gelsen say, if it ceases, you want to meet with it again. Both are true, right, for pleasant feeling. So when you're having a pleasant feeling, you don't want to be parted from it, and then if you are parted from it, you want to meet with it again. And then we can say the same thing about suffering, right? So, or unpleasant feeling. So an unpleasant feeling or a suffering feeling is that which, when it arises, you wish to be separated from it. And you could add to that, right? And when it ceases, you don't want it to happen again, right? That would be an unpleasant feeling. And then that which is neither pleasant nor unpleasant or suffering is that which, when it arises, neither of these two wishes occur. One point is, do you see there, like, so this is defining what are feelings, right? A few points worth noting here, just very briefly. One is, that's the definition, or an explanation of what feeling, this aggregate or this mental factor is. Another point is, notice that it's emphasizing the person's experience, right? And that's very individual, because it's not, because we so emphasize, Buddhism does this over and over again, and I think it's wonderful, and we often don't notice it, I often don't notice it, is there's a de-emphasizing of the object, right? Because it's not about the object, right? Because a given object will be found to be pleasant at certain moments, unpleasant at other moments, neutral at other moments, right? There is no object that's intrinsically pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. It's a subjective experience, isn't it? And we get confused, I'm just pointing it out, and we get confused by that, right? Because we get confused that the experience of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral depends upon many factors, the main of which is, as he says, is our karma, but it's also other factors, right? Like, so like, and that's clear, isn't it? Like, actually, at least there are countless examples of this, right? But I was just talking to somebody the other day who had COVID, and they were saying, oh, wow, my favorite food tasted like nothing, so it's not the food that has a pleasant, right? If the food by its nature had a pleasant it was a pleasant feeling, then even if the person lost their sense of taste, it would still taste pleasant to them, right? So in other words, it depends upon the organ, the tongue. It depends upon the sense power. It depends upon the consciousness. It depends upon that you're not sick. It depends upon many factors for it to be a pleasant feeling, right? And that person, temporarily their karma changed. It was no longer pleasant. It was neutral, right? I think maybe slightly unpleasant because they were missing the pleasant feeling of what they previously experienced. So anyway, so it's not about the object, it's an experience, it's subjective. Another point, which I just is, kind of obvious, but just to briefly mention, right, is, or remind ourselves of, is that we, in other words, ordinary people, when we have pleasant feelings, we tend, we want to meet with them again, we don't want to be parted from them. And so ordinarily, what happens? We generate desire, right? We generate craving, we can generate addiction, we can generate greed. We can generate all kinds of mental afflictions, right? And then when we experience suffering feelings or painful feelings, right, we can, oftentimes we ordinary people, what happens, right? We generate, as I said a minute ago, aversion, anger, hatred, despising, and so on, right? And and that's how we generate. Then we, and due to those, we create actions, right? And that's so. Do you see the? I mean, that's part of how we create our own samsara, in a sense, right? So that's part of what we do in reaction to this mental factor of feeling, which is why it's so important to be aware of it and to understand it. And then Damcha has hand up. Oh, you're muted.
Are these definitions of pleasant, unpleasant, neutral feelings referring to ordinary beings? Because it says, that when a pleasant feeling ceases, you want to meet with it again. Would a Buddha have the same wish? Or how would or would is this definition just referring to us?
Interesting question.
The reason I ask is I know that the subsequent steps are for a Buddha would be different. They wouldn't develop attachment and aversion, obviously, but do they have that wish to meet with it again, or the?
That's an interesting question. I would say one point I'll make about ordinary beings is, we'll see as we go along that there's a point in here where it says that there's a point in this text actually where it points out, that it gives on the next page, it gives an example of a arhat. So these are true of so one point is that this definition would apply to Aryas, like to those who've seen emptiness directly, and it would even apply to arhats, so the beings who have achieved liberation. But that's a different. Your question is a little different than that. Does it apply to Buddhas? And that's an interesting question. First of all, I want to be honest. I'm not sure. Is one point. My honest starting point is I'm not certain. I mean, I know it applies because the text says, so we can say it definitely applies to Aryas, and it definitely applies to Arhats. In the case of a Buddha, I'm not sure. I mean, one point is that Buddhas don't experience suffering, and they don't. And I would. That's clear. My own assertion, this is my assertion personally, which I could debate with, is that Buddhas also don't experience neutral feelings, because Buddhas, by their nature, are gone to bliss. Are their experiences, is always blissful. So that's an interesting question, though. Do they wish to meet with it again? I guess one other. It's an interesting question.
Or maybe they wouldn't have the wish because they're always blissed out.
Yeah, that I don't know. It would be interesting. Well, the other point I'm contemplating is Buddhas don't have conceptual thoughts, and so they wouldn't have. They certainly wouldn't have the thought, may I meet with this again, or may I not be parted from this, because they wouldn't conceptualize in that way. But is there a version of, would this definition apply to a Buddha? That's as far as I can go. I'm not sure beyond that. It's an interesting question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, I'll just share a side point. This is not an answer to your question, but I'll just share a side point. I remember, it's a Vajrayana text, but there's one Vajrayana text that I remember studying one time that described how at a certain level of the path where somebody was quite close to Buddhahood, as a way of, but it's a practitioner still, not a Buddha, but it's like somebody who's very advanced, that they would go out and intentionally seek out, like they would go out on the road somewhere and intentionally seek out what had previously been suffering experiences, to see would it still be experience bliss, and so they would go and intentionally, have some experience that had previously they would have found unpleasant, to see, is my experience equally blissful? Like, so they would be, in meditation experiencing bliss, but then they would like leave their meditation hut or whatever and go out and go somewhere to happen, like to encounter some phenomena that they used to find unpleasant or suffering. And they would be like, oh, wow, it's still bliss, like they're still blissed out. It was like and then they would know that they had achieved, it was one way of checking if they had achieved that level of the path, was like, no matter what happened, were they still blissful? So it wasn't masochistic because they wouldn't do it until they reached that level. But it was like it was a way of self-assessing, a self-assessment technique or something. It's kind of funny, but Sujata, yeah.
I'm thinking about Venerable's question, and like the word wish, I think, is where I'm stuck. Like, to me, it's hard to have a wish without a desire, or like some really subtle feeling of craving. Like, I mean, the only situation which I think I could have a wish without any sort of craving is when I'm wishing for the end of suffering of other beings, right? Like, that's not I mean, right now it's like, I'm thinking like Buddha's having the wish for all of our liberation doesn't feel like attachment to us, right? Versus all other wishes of like pleasantries. It's that word pleasant made me think of pleasantries, and then made me think, if I have a wish, that it's craving. And even now, like, as and how these baby steps towards compassion that I've taken, like, I know that most of the time when I don't want others to suffer, it's that I don't want to suffer my suffering that they suffer. Like, I don't like other people suffering. It's not their suffering, it's my suffering they're suffering, right? So I don't know, like, it just when I think about the craving that's sort of tied into any sort of wishing for a repeat experience, that it feels like the Buddhas wouldn't have that. And that there would be something else going on with regard to them wanting to meet with the experience of other people's liberation, for example, that doesn't feel like I mean, sure, that's like pleasant when that happens, but I don't know. I don't know if it's a feeling, if they have those feelings at all.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to speculate. I mean, what you're saying makes sense to me as well. I don't want to speculate too much because I may get it wrong, and I don't want to sort of say, something I'm not sure about. But because I haven't really, same question. I mean, for sure, they say, yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, what is it? I'm just contemplating. What does it mean? They'll say, they'll like Gyume Khenpo, for example, will often point out, he'll say, if the best offering you can make to the Buddhas is compassion for others. Right? He'll say, if you work for the welfare of others, that's the best. The Buddhas don't need your water bowl or your flower. I mean, you can offer those things to create merit. He says, but what actually pleases the Buddhas is when you work for the welfare of others, when you alleviate somebody else's suffering. That's the best offering to the Buddha. And it pleases the Buddha, right? But so what does it mean to please? It's an interesting question. What does it mean to please the Buddha? You could contemplate that quite a bit, couldn't you? Like, it's kind of getting at what you're saying, Sujata. Because, in a sense, what would that mean? Right? Because if the Buddha, in one way it makes sense, because the Buddha has compassion for all beings. So if you're helping to alleviate the suffering of beings, that is fulfilling wish of the Buddha. And in another sense, what does it mean for a Buddha to be pleased? I think it's an interesting contemplation. The Buddha is already pleased, but they're pleased by your love, and so on for others. So anyway, it's interesting. I don't know. I'm not quite sure. The Buddha's experience is quite mysterious, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, well, so then next he says, when he's now, it's just category. This next section is just kind of a categorization thing. So he says, when these three types of feelings are differentiated in terms of the supports of body and mind, there are 6 types: 3 bodily feelings and 3 mental feelings. And right, so and then he lists them right there. Bodily feelings that are pleasant, bodily feelings that are suffering, and bodily feelings that are neutral, or mental feelings that are pleasant, mental that are suffering, and mental that are neutral. That is important, though. Just want to pause there. Like, why is he pointing out? One is that's true, right? There, in other words, Well, let's continue on just with this next section. So he says, what is the difference between a bodily and a mental feeling? One point is, because remember, well, I will say here, feelings that arise in the retinue of the five sense consciousnesses are called bodily feelings. Feelings that arise in the retinue of a mental consciousness are called mental feelings. So I want to point out a couple of things. One is, remember, feeling is a mental factor, right? So in other words, the body itself is form, is matter, right? So the body in and of itself doesn't have feeling. It's the sense consciousnesses, right, that would experience bodily feelings, right? So it's still mental, right? I mean, or still mind, but not mental. Mental would be wrong because that's there's the mental consciousness, and then there are the sense consciousnesses. But the sense consciousnesses are still consciousness. Maybe that's the right way to phrase this, right? So so one point is, because if the body without consciousness had feeling, then corpses would have feeling, but they don't. Is one point, right? Corpses don't feel something pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. They feel nothing because there's no consciousness there, right? So so one point that's being implied here is that consciousness is what experiences this mental factor of feeling. And so a bodily feeling, right, means a feeling that is accompanying the experience of a sense conscious. So, and so it's something that it's like, and that's different than when the mental consciousness experiences feeling. Actually, let's just pause there. He's going to say more about that, but these are closely related. At one point, aren't they? But he's getting at that both exist, and we're going to say more about that. But what he's getting at in a way is like that. Before you, what's the word? Conceptualize about something, there can be the mental factor of feeling can already be there. So if you hear music that you love, right? What is being implied here is that there can be a bodily feeling that's pleasant, right? And then you may conceptualize a pleasant mental feeling. Oh, I love this music. This is one of my favorite composers or bands or whatever, right? And the same with unpleasant, right? Like there is, if, well, say with sound, right? If you suddenly hear like an extremely loud, if you're asleep and somebody starts running a very loud lawnmower right outside your window, even before you cognize, or even before you, what's the word, have conceptual thoughts about that, you can see somebody's face go like this, something like, or there's a bodily feeling associated. In this case, that case would be with the ear consciousness that's unpleasant, right? And then you might think, oh, how could they be so whatever? I was sleeping. How can they be insensitive or something, whatever? And that would be a mental unpleasant feeling. So we don't know. I'm just pointing out to go slow here. He's pointing out a difference, right? And this is a tool for mindfulness. Is one point, right? Like, in other words, you can start to notice this. When is my pleasant or unpleasant or neutral feeling bodily, right? And then when does it become mental, right? When does it become? And in general, the mental ones are going to be there can be very brief for ordinary people. Mental feelings that are non-conceptual. But most mental feelings for us, the ones we're aware of actually, are going to be, for the most part, conceptual, right? So when is and we're going to go into more about that, but when is my pleasant or unpleasant feeling non-conceptual and part of my sensory experience? And when is it conceptual? And it's interesting to notice that, right? Like in your own experience, right? Tactile, whether it's tactile, like I was aware of that yesterday. I just positively reflect on it, but like yesterday, when it was a warm day here, and I went for a swim for exercise, whatever. And when I was in the water, I was like, there was a certain point I was like, oh wow, like I've been studying and working and thinking a lot, and I realized like, oh, I'm not thinking now. I'm just in the water and feeling the water. It was pleasant, and I was aware it was a bodily pleasant feeling. I wasn't thinking about it until I noticed that, but right? There's like, so there can be a long stretch where there's like a bodily pleasant feeling, and then you notice it and think about it. Oh, wow, I like swimming, or I like water, or whatever. Then it becomes mental, right? And the same with the unpleasant, right? There can be times where you're just caught up in the physical, if you're feeling very sick, for example, or having pain in your body, right? There can be a long stretch where you're focused on a bodily unpleasant feeling. And then you may switch to thinking about it and say, oh, why is this happening to me? Or some other, whatever that may be, some mental unpleasant feeling. So you can notice the difference between them, right? And also notice how how your conceptual mental feeling states relate to the physical. Lynn, go ahead.
Is there a way in which you can get into, and I don't even know, a consciousness where you have neither a bodily or mental feeling? I'll give you the example. We have a client who was sex trafficked, okay? So we had to prepare her for the psychiatric exam. So I was really very scared of doing it. Okay, so I was like, I have to do it, but I don't want to hear about this. It just sounds so horrible what happened to her. And then at some point, I mean, she's an amazing person. So, I mean, who's overcome incredible things. So when she started talking about it, it was like being present. It wasn't terrible. It was like somehow the compassion, or I don't know what it was, it broke through, and I felt neither good or bad about it. It was like I didn't have any feeling about it. And after it was done, I thought that was sort of an amazing experience, that I didn't feel bad, or I didn't feel happy we had made it through, or it wasn't as bad. I just didn't have any feeling. So it was an interesting, I don't know how to describe it as an experience, but it was like being there with her. It was okay. I mean, it wasn't good or bad. Maybe I should put it that way.
So, well, Lynn, let me ask you, would that fit with, like, I'm going to go back and on this, up higher on this page, I'm going to read you a line that we read earlier, which says, the Vasubandhu thing, where he says, that which is neither pleasant nor suffering is that which, when it arises, neither the wish to be closer, neither the wish to repeat it again, nor the wish to avoid it occurs. So it's neither, what he's making the point is, one type of feeling is neutral, which is neither pleasant nor suffering. So would that be what you're describing? The neutral feeling? Maybe
neutral, or thinking back, the way I sensed it is it was no feeling. It was just, I was in the moment. So I didn't feel anything.
What he would say is that would be the new, according to Buddhism, that would be the neutral. Yeah, I think that would be, from a Buddhist perspective, that is what a neutral feeling is. In other words, that there's neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So it's kind of a neutral. Yeah, and they would describe that as a feeling. They would say that is the aggregate of feeling, but it's a neutral type of feeling that's neither pleasant nor unpleasant. That would be I think that what you're describing is exactly what Buddhism would describe, I think, as the neutral feeling. So there's no pleasant or unpleasant feeling tone to it.
But see, that seems closer to me to meditation than good or bad, or pleasant or unpleasant, or suffering.
Now, according to Buddhism, even meditative states have feeling, though.
Right.
Okay. So, according to Buddhism, it's omnipresent. So all mental states, all meditative states include the aggregate, the mental factor of feeling. Some mental states, in some meditations, it would be pleasant, and some meditative states would be neutral, according to Buddhism. So meditative states usually have either a pleasant or a neutral feeling, depending on which meditation you're doing and what you're practicing. But so even meditative states have this mental factor of feeling, according to Buddhist psychology. Yeah, that's true. Let's just pause and reflect on it. But yeah. So according to Buddhism, all the all it's an omnipresent, so it's always there. So they would say, yeah, even in deep meditation, one has feeling, a subtle form sometimes of feeling. And sometimes it's neutral though. So and neutral just means neither positive nor negative in that sense. So neither that one is not having a pleasant or a suffering experience.
And you'd be conscious of that.
Actually, I would say we're not always conscious of our feelings. Sometimes we don't notice them because we're distracted, for example, or so it's there. Like there are many mental factors that can be present, but that we don't always notice. Yeah, so we're not always like sort of consciously aware of our feelings, I guess is one way of putting it. Because for example, there are even feelings in dreams, right? Feelings are present in our dreams, but we're not always aware of. Certainly, we're not always aware in our dreams, for example, that we're feeling pleasant or unpleasant. Sometimes when you wake up, you might go, "Oh, wow, that was a really wonderful dream," or "That was a very disturbing dream," or whatever. But we're not. But in the dream, we're not always aware. "Oh, I'm feeling pleasant or unpleasant," and so on. I mean, there could be other things like that.
But I think of it, maybe this is mistaken, is neutral feelings are sort of the opposite of attachment. In other words, if you work through your attachment, then you get to a neutral state.
Oh, I see. I guess according to Buddhism, though, it's not necessarily. I mean, that could be an example of a neutral feeling, but like in this teaching, in what we're talking about, it could be much more mundane than that. In other words, it doesn't have to be a practitioner. It could be an ordinary, like, so for example, like I'll give an example, like let's say an ordinary person who's like, I'll give it just a very mundane example. If somebody's on like a long drive, like driving across many states, and then they, like, you say, "Oh, well," the person later they say, "Oh, I was really appreciating the scenery and in West Virginia," and then we got to the whatever, then we got to some very straight highway. I don't really remember, after a while, I don't even remember what, suddenly we were 3 hours later. That 3 hours would be a neutral feeling in a sense. Like so that wasn't, that's not some meditative state, and that's not that they've overcome attachment. They were just they weren't having a pleasant or an unpleasant feeling, and they were kind of distracted for a few hours because it was a long drive, and they were just zoning out. That would be a neutral feeling. Yeah, so zoning out would be an example of a neutral feeling. So it's not always, I mean, one version of a neutral feeling could be quite wonderful, right? Like somebody cultivated equanimity, and they're, a meditator who's kind of able to kind of, previously had been grasping at something and now sort of liberates them from suffering. That is one version, which you're talking about, which is very good. But it could also just be, somebody who's zoned out, or, sometimes it could be, there are all kinds of versions of that. Somebody who's, watching stupid TV shows and zoned out, or, whatever, like, and really not present. They're not even enjoying it. They're just sort of there, and they're whatever. What do you call that when somebody watches one? Binging on Netflix or something, whatever that is, where they're just sort of neutral. They're not, sometimes people can enjoy it, but there are times where somebody's just not even, they're just sort of not, they're zoned out in a way. That would be an example of a neutral feeling. Then if you're really zoned out, it's not even pleasant.
Okay.
And then Damche,
Yeah, I have two questions about the conceptual and the non-conceptual mental feelings. It seems like the conceptual mental feelings are actually discrimination. Like if you start to think this is this, oh, I am angry. You could be getting into the mental factor discrimination. And then the second question I have is that, is the non-conceptual mental feeling just something that happens very fast because we're feeling the bodily aspect, and then we're just not able to it just non-conceptually feel mentally? It just seems more subtle or more difficult to.
Yeah, I'll answer I'll answer the second one first because that's easy and that's quick and easy. Is yes. So first of all, like they say like for arias, they can actually notice and really be very aware of those moments of mental direct perception. But for ordinary people, we don't notice them actually. So there is what they say is if you're having a sensory experience of any object, ordinary, just like an ordinary experience now, this is just in general in Buddhist psychology, they say then there's like a moment that's extremely brief of a mental direct perception of oftentimes can happen. And then you go into conceptual mental knowing. But they say ordinary people aren't even aware of that. So there will be a feeling, a tone associated with that one moment of mental awareness. And I suppose it would be whatever the feeling tone was of the previous sensory would usually, I assume, would carry over. So I think probably all the time, but we're not aware of that. So you're right, it's too subtle for us to notice. They say Aryas notice that, but we don't. That's one point. So that question is easy. And then the other question about the difference between feeling and discrimination is, so the aggregate of discrimination, I want to go back, I want to make sure I get it right. Were you asking about, you were talking about the conceptual feeling.
Mental feeling. I just don't get how the feeling can be conceptual without getting into mental factor discrimination.
So one point is, I want to point out a couple of points. One is, remember, these are both omnipresent. So there is so when you're having a conceptual experience of anything, right, you're going to be having both feeling and discrimination. They're both going to be present. But so you remember I said earlier, like if you, all these mental factors are like, go along with, or accompany the main mind. And in a sense, you can say they're of one entity with the main mind, but they're different isolates. They're different, they can be understood to be different functions, but they're not separate entities. It's not like discriminations over there and feelings over here, but they serve different functions. I'll explain that. It's like, so, the discrimination serves the function, as we'll get into in the next section, of, knowing the unique characteristics of a thing. Whereas feeling is this experience of enjoying or not enjoying, of finding it pleasant or finding it unpleasant. So I guess, and so one point is, I'm just getting it from an experiential perspective, right? In my example I mentioned earlier, when I was asking Katerimshe question, right? Like, so if like there could be, I was using the example, I gave him that example where I said, if I saw a person on the road and then I had a discrimination, oh, I don't like this person, they're my enemy. Like, in other words, I see the unique characteristics of that person there, that's so-and-so, and they, whatever, they once did this to me, and therefore I don't, my point is like recognizing who the person is, their name, and so on. That's discrimination. That's the function of discrimination. But then, so I might have had at first a neutral feeling. At first, I might have discriminated. Oh, there's a person in the distance, human, and then that's because it's an omnipresent mental factor. And then my feeling might have been neutral, right? Like, I don't have any particular feeling about somebody I can't see clearly. And then if I discriminate, oh, that's so-and-so, that's Joe, who I don't like, or something, enemy. That's the function of discrimination, is the recognition, oh, that's that person's name, for example, in this case. But then the feeling would be a different mental factor in that, it would be the feeling, the experience of unpleasantness, right? Which is not, so, and that feeling of unpleasant is not the function of discrimination. The function of discrimination is just recognizing, oh, that's Joe. Whereas the function of the feeling is this unpleasant, like, where you start to feel, as he puts it here, right, the wish to be separated from that person, right? Like, in other words, it's an unpleasant feeling where you think, oh, I don't want to see them because just seeing them makes me feel unpleasant. So it's two different mental factors, but they're not it's not like they exist there differently in time. They're coexistent in time, but they're different mental factors. Does that explain?
Yeah, and that wish to be separated from it, that's the conceptual aspect of the feeling.
Oh,
Because
I see what you're
I'm
saying.
having a hard time understanding how. I know this is thick of me, but I can't seem to get.
Seriously. I'll go back. So the
Like, how would you conceive of the feeling at that time that you, let's say you've discriminated, oh boy, here he comes again. I don't like him. But then there's that, okay, what would the conceptual feeling look, how would you?
I see. So I guess I would say it this way, like, that's an interesting point. Like, so the concept, I mean, one point is that the feeling is still, I guess I would say it this way, probably a better way to think about it is that that the feeling is associated with a conceptual mind. That's probably the better way to think about it. So in other words, that it's a conceptual mind, it's a conceptual, like we talked, like there are non-conceptual knowers, which are direct perceptions. And then there are conceptual knowers, which know by way of concepts, right? And a concept is, we've talked about this before. A concept is where there's a meaning generality and a sound, viewing a sound generality or so a name, and a meaning generality, meaning a meaning, as an understanding of something, as suitable to be mixed. So you could say when the main mind is conceptual, the feeling that accompanies that mind is a conceptual, is a mental feeling that's conceptual. So the mental feeling is not the thought in that sense. It's the feeling that it's the feeling of pleasant or suffering that accompanies a conceptual knower. So as soon as I'm having a conceptual knower, I'm thinking, and I'm like, using my example, right? Like, with there to have both. So if you think about conceptual knowers, right? I'm making up a fictional thing here, but so there's a sound generality. Oh, that's Joe. Joe would be the sound generality. Now, my meaning, which is not actually it's not anybody else's meaning necessarily in this fictional example of Joe, is the meaning that's associated with Joe is this person who I don't like, is my enemy, right? So that's a conceptual knower at that point. And then there's a feeling associated with that conceptual knower that's an unpleasant feeling. That's the mental factor of feeling. So I mean, so it's not that the thoughts themselves, a specific thought is the feeling. It's that this mental factor of feeling is associated with a conceptual mind, not with a non-conceptual. So that's the difference.
And the feeling itself would be mental. I mean,
Exactly.
I'm aware of my bodily feelings, not all the time, but sometimes, I mean, and that may or may not accompany this feeling, but there is a mental component with the feeling.
Yeah, and one way of getting at that is like if you think right now, like think of somebody who's not present who you don't like, think of a historical figure or socio-political figure, whatever, who you don't like, and if you think of that person and think of them doing something harmful, like that you view as harmful or something, right? Or as negative or as whatever, and when you think of them, there's a kind of unpleasant feeling, and that would be the example of a mental suffering feeling. Or if you think of, just this morning I was talking to, last night we were talking about something on that, or recently I was talking about it, and then I remember, like if I remember a time when I remember a time when somebody almost crashed into me on the road, that's clearly a mental experience. I'm not on the road, and there's no sensory. That's not a sensory experience, it's a mental experience, it's a memory in that sense, right? And then there's an unpleasant feeling that arises. If I remember that incident, that would be an example of a mental suffering. So in other words, and in that case, I'm not thinking, it's not a thought that's the mental suffering. It's that there's a conceptual knower of, oh, this happened, and I was in this I was in a rental car and this other car or whatever, it's all that's all conceptual. But there's the feeling associated with those conceptual knowers that's unpleasant. And the same thing if I think of the person, you think of a person who a historical figure who you feel badly towards, when you think of them, there's an unpleasant feeling tone, that's the mental. So it's not that it's the specific thought, it's the feeling associated with a mental, with a conceptual knower. That's what he's saying. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm going to have to do a little work on this because it's hard for me not to blur in the bodily feeling with it. Like I can, if I am angry at somebody, I'm aware of my bodily feeling.
Yeah.
But
And you actually, it's good to stay with that though. Just I want to say is then what you're doing actually is great. Is you're starting to be aware of that. It can go both ways. That's what you're pointing out, which is correct, right? So I was giving the example where one has an external unpleasant experience, an experience of an external phenomena that one finds unpleasant, right? And then that gives rise to a mental suffering, where like, and that often happens. But you're right. In other words, sometimes it goes the opposite way, right? Where like if I'm sitting around ruminating, right? I can sit there and ruminate about something negative that one's had, something that I think somebody said or whatever. So up to a certain point, and it's actually an interesting experiment to go through. How long is my suffering mental, right? The feeling of suffering is mental, but then there comes a point when it's a bodily feeling. In this case, it might be a somatic feeling, right, in the body of agitation, of anger, of whatever, and then it's somatic, so it becomes a bodily feeling at that point. So then it's going in the reverse order, but both, and then you might give rise to another mental suffering. Now look, now I even feel in a bad mood. Now I'm feeling all agitated because of this person, and then it goes back to the mental again, and then you can go back and forth and back. And that's what rumination actually does, isn't it? It's how we get all kinds of problems. But so you can see how you can create a physiological unpleasant sensation based upon a mental one, or vice versa. Yeah, and you're getting at something very profound and important, which is we do both, and you can actually watch both happen, experientially, which is very useful. And that's why we're that. And I think it's great. You see, this is why it could seem a little, why are they listing the 3 bodily and the 3 mental? This is why, is that it's quite useful to then go, oh wow, that's how I do that. I create my own suffering in this way. If I'm ruminating, for example. Because then to notice but it's useful to notice it starts mental and then becomes physical, because I can control it more easily on the mental level if I control my mind, and then I won't have that physical suffering. So that's very useful then, I think.
thank you.
Yeah. And then he raises and then our author raises a qualm, right? He says, well then, what is the reason for calling the feeling that arises in the retinue of an I consciousness a bodily feeling, even though the I and the body are not the same? Right? So he's, or hearing, right? You could say the same, right? There, he gives the example of I, but you could say the same for ear or nose or something. And then he says, response, the treatise on the 400 stanzas, which is a text by Aryadeva, says, then there's a very famous quote where it says, just as the body sense power pervades the body, likewise ignorance abides in all. And it says, just as it has been said above, the body sense power pervades one's entire body from the crown down to the soles of the feet. Thus, any feeling arising in the retinue of the other 4 sense consciousness, such as the I consciousness, is also called a bodily feeling. Also in the 6 feelings. Anyway, I want to clarify this a little bit. First of all, the quote from Aryadeva, if you're not familiar with it, it can be confusing, so I should clarify. So he says, just as the body sense power pervades the body, likewise ignorance abides in all. First of all, what Aryadeva is getting at there, he's making 2 points actually. One is the bodily sense power pervades all the other sense powers. And then he's saying similarly, when it says ignorance abides in all, what that means is ignorance abides in all the mental afflictions. So Aryadeva is making a general point, which is not the emphasis here, which is that ignorance grasping at inherent existence pervades all of our other mental afflictions. And therefore, he's making a very profound point, Aryadeva, which is that's why if you overcome ignorance, you can rid yourself of hatred and of craving and of pride and of arrogance and so on. So that's what Aryadeva is getting at there. It's a wonderful passage in the 400 stanzas that is very profound. But so in that passage, though, Arya David's saying the bodily sense power pervades all the other sense powers. And so what he really, it's quite simple in that sense. What he's getting at here is that any sensory experience, right? If it's a sensory experience, it's non-conceptual and therefore is categorized here as bodily, right? So if you hear something, and actually we know that, don't we? And what he's saying is actually it's true in the sense that what's he say, right? Like, you know, if you hear something very unpleasant, if like, you know, if you hear something unpleasant, it does affect how your body feels. If you see something unpleasant, actually, like you know, like it affects. I mean, it's a visual consciousness, but first of all, your eyes are part of your body actually, and also it affects your body, doesn't it? Ever notice that? Like I was noticing, like if you I was noticing that the other day, like if you're eating and then you if you saw something very extremely unpleasant, it would be hard to even want to eat, right? Like or you know, and so on. Like so, it's because they're interconnected. The eyes are part of the body, and it affects your body. But so anyway, the general point here is that any sensory experience is categorized as bodily. And so going back to, you know, like these points you were making earlier, actually, it's quite interesting, isn't it? I'll just give one more example. Going back to Dom, to your point, right? Like about how it affects the body. It's true, isn't it? Like if you think about, for example, if you ruminate, going back to my example earlier, if you were ruminating about somebody who made you angry, right? And then your body started to get angry. Actually, it's an interesting point. And then if somebody put on music that you might have liked previously, you might actually find it agitating, right? Which is interesting, right? Because it's like, so your mind affects your body, which then affects how your ear consciousness experiences a certain sound, right? Anyway, it's just interesting, isn't it? How much what it's getting at here is the interactions between our, you know, and I was getting the same point, right? Food, right? That if you're really, you know, Shanti Deva says that in the Guides of the Bodhisattva's way of life, right? Like if you're really angry, you can't sleep, you can't eat, right? Like in other words, food won't taste good that you would ordinarily like. It's the same point with music, same point with a beautiful scenery, right? You know, if you're people like, right, anyway, if you're on vacation someplace beautiful and you're having a big fight with your family members, suddenly it doesn't look so beautiful. You know, so it's the interaction between mind and body are being on that here. But to notice the difference in our experience and to notice how one interacts with the other, how these different kinds of feelings can build on each other is part of the point. Then he says, also when the 6 feelings are differentiated into now he's getting into another category. So that was one category, right? Bodily and mental. Now he's going to raise another category. So he's getting in different ways of categorizing feelings, and each has a different function. So we just talked about the previous one, which was the function is to notice how they interact and affect you. This next one may not be your experience yet, but it's an aspirational one, I guess we'd say. So now he says, also, when the 6 feelings are differentiated into 2, the materialistic and the non-materialistic, then there are 12. So rather than 6, there becomes 12. So now he's saying, well, wait a second. You could say, wait a second, the qualm, right? I'm doing a modern version. He says qualm. I say, hey, wait a minute. What do you mean by materialistic and non-materialistic? What's that, right? Because he just brought up a new category, right? So you can say, what are you talking about? And then he says, feelings that are concomitant with the craving for the contaminated appropriate aggregates are called materialistic feelings. Feelings that are concomitant with the exalted wisdom directly realizing selflessness are called non-materialistic feelings. So part of my point, you know, so materialistic here doesn't mean, you know, in English sometimes, at least when I was growing up, they were talking about, oh, you're being so materialistic. I don't know if they still say that phrase, like, you know, like, so this is not getting at that, right? Like, oh, you know, materialistic meant you wanted to go to the mall and buy a lot of stuff, and you know, if you weren't materialistic, then you didn't care about that. You know, you were like hippie or something, I don't know, whatever. They were like some kind of idea. That's not what's being gotten at here. So what's being gotten at here is so we, and why I said this may not be our experience yet is most of us don't yet have what are being, we're all materialistic in this sense, right? And non-materialistic here is an exalted state. So going back, so what is a material? So materialistic feelings are the feelings of ordinary people. So all the feelings of ordinary people would be categorized as materialistic in this sense, because it says concomitant with craving for the contaminated appropriate aggregates. So any feeling connected with a body and a mind, what does it mean contaminated appropriated aggregates? So contaminated here means, so aggregates are our 5 aggregates, right? Our body and our mental factor, our mind and mental factors, right? And so on. So those are our aggregates. What does it mean contaminated, right? Well, actually, let's go with appropriate. Appropriated means, what does it mean to appropriate the aggregates? That means you were born into them, right? That from the bardo, you appropriated them, meaning you took rebirth in them, you took them on as yours, right? You manifested them based on your karma. And that's the contaminated, right? Contaminated means it arose through the power of karma and mental afflictions, right? And contaminated karma in a sense means karma not, it's karma created by somebody who has not realized emptiness directly. So we have, so ordinary people, some of you are Arya Bodhisattvas, but if not, then we have contaminated aggregates, contaminated appropriate aggregates. So that, and what that means is that our rebirth, right, our being as a person is conditioned by and is created by karma from a previous life and mental afflictions. That's how we created this life, this body and mind. And so any feeling associated with concomitant with the craving for these kinds of aggregates is materialistic. So then what is a non-materialistic feeling? That would be a feeling associated with, one commentary said, you could say associated with true paths and true cessations, or another way of saying it is in a Art's book, he had an interesting description. He said associated with nirvana, but in general, it's associated with the meditate. So it's basically it's a feeling in the continuum of an Arya, of somebody who's seen emptiness directly. So he says here, feelings that are concomitant with the exalted wisdom directly realized in selflessness that are called non-materialistic feelings. So it's the feelings associated with someone who's realized emptiness directly. Then he says, well then, if one were to explain the above, so based on that definition, materialistic feelings are obvious then, right? In other words, that there are pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feelings of ordinary people. If you're spaced out, we were talking about it just now, right? If you're spaced out, then you're having a neutral feeling. If somebody says something that bothers you, then you're having a suffering feeling. If you have your, whatever, if you have some pleasant experience, you're having a pleasant experience. But now he says, quam, right? Because these non-materialistic feelings associated with Aryas, they're not so familiar to us, first of all, right? If we're not Aryas. And so he raises a qualm where again, he says, well then, if one were to explain the above mentioned non-materialistic suffering feeling, how can a suffering feeling be present in those who possess the exalted wisdom directly realizing selflessness, right? So he's saying, well, how do Aryas suffer, right? They've seen emptiness directly, right? They have the meditative, they possess the exalted wisdom that directly realizes selflessness, emptiness, right? How do they suffer? And then he responds. He said, and this is what I was mentioning earlier about what, in reference to Damchu's question about Buddhas, I always said, I'm not quite sure, but we can say Aryas for sure, because it talks about it here. It says, there are many such cases. For example, the scripture on discipline says that even foe-destroyers who have abandoned the conceptions of self-experience have suffering feelings such as headaches due to the fruition of past actions. So what this is getting at is that one point is when Aryas are in meditative equipoise, directly realizing emptiness, they can't have suffering feelings, of course, because they don't have any dualistic experience at that time. There's no dualism, right? They're in a non-dualistic state, so they can't have suffering feelings at that time. But there's a state that we call post-meditative, a post-meditative state, or there are different terms for it. But basically, after arising from meditation, Aryas who have seen emptiness directly, and even Arhats, have a post-meditative equipoise. And so he's giving the example that there are many stories of Arhats who had physical suffering. So and part of the point here is Arhats are not capable of mental suffering. They don't have mental suffering, but they can have physical suffering due to the previous karma, due to their karma from, so in other words, there was a karma that threw them into that body, and then they achieve arhatship. But before they die, they still have a body that was created by karma. And so that that body can still have the manifestation of suffering. And so he's saying that's an example of non-materialistic feeling of suffering. And the same can happen for bodhisattvas, so they say, bodhisattva who's realized emptiness directly could still have a physical experience of suffering is possible.
Lauren?
Yeah.
What's the difference between an Arya and an Arhat in what that is concerned?
Oh, sure. Good question. So the difference is, like, an Arya is anyone who's realized emptiness. Anyone who's realized emptiness directly is an Arya. But like, if you think of so there are many examples. So for example, like there are examples where somebody has realized emptiness directly, but an Arhat is somebody who's not only realized emptiness directly, but they've eliminated all the mental afflictions and their seeds. So what they say is that usually, like, when somebody realizes emptiness direct, there are some people who achieve arhatship right when they realize emptiness, but most practitioners, when they realize emptiness, first of all bodhisattvas are like this. They don't become an arhat right away in the Sutrayana system. So anyway, just to make it simple. So what happens is, when somebody's realized emptiness directly at first, they eliminate certain mental afflictions, but not all of them. And so then they have to keep meditating on emptiness to get rid of the rest of the mental afflictions, and eventually they become an arhat once they've gotten rid of all the mental afflictions. So it's by meditating on emptiness, they get rid of the mental afflictions. But when they first realize emptiness, they only get rid of some. So they have to keep meditating on emptiness, and then eventually they get rid of all of them, and then they're an arhat. So sometimes, like in the sutras, you'll see they'll talk about a stream enterer. So a stream enterer is somebody who's just realized emptiness directly. So they're an Arya, but they're not yet an Arhat. And then they talk about a once returner, somebody who has to take one more rebirth. And then there's a non-returner. That's somebody who's like doesn't have to take any more rebirths, but they're not yet an Arhat. So those would be examples of Aryas who are not yet Arhats, and then eventually they become an Arhat. But so an Arhat is somebody who's eliminated every single seed of the mental afflictions and their imprints, or their seeds, all the mental afflictions and also their seeds. That's what we say. And so I'll give one more example. Like a bodhisattva, when they achieve the path of seeing, they're an Arya. They've seen emptiness directly, right? That's what the path of seeing is. But they say such bodhisattvas have eliminated certain mental afflictions, but they still have they still have various kinds of mental afflictions. They haven't gotten rid of all of them yet. Does that explain it?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was the example of he was explaining what the non-materialistic. And so so our goal, and one way of saying it is, our goal would be to eventually experience the non-materialistic feelings, right? The experiences of an Arya. That would be the experience of somebody who's seen emptiness directly. And that's quite wonderful. So that's another categorization. And you can see it's like that, you can say that's an aspirational categorization for us, but it's good to understand that happens. Damshi, your question earlier would be an interesting one, is like, are Buddhas included in non-material? I don't know that. I've just never heard that explained, and it wasn't in any of the commentaries. would a Buddha be explained under the category of non-materialistic feelings? It's an interesting question. I'm not 100% sure. Then it says, furthermore, when feelings are divided by way of their supports, there are 6. And so this is quite clear. So that feeling, and another of the omnipresent mental factors is contact, which we'll get into later, but here it mentions it. So it says, feeling arising from contact upon the aggregation of visible form and eye sense power and eye consciousness. So that would be, right, that's one kind of feeling, would be feeling associated with the, and it's getting at, though, that what this is getting at is what? Is that, first of all, feeling only arises based on contact. Contact is always present and feelings are always present, because they're omnipresent mental factors. But they depend upon 3 things coming together, right? So something visible form, something to be seen. You could say an eye organ, right? The eye sense power, and then the eye consciousness. So you need all 3. And then you can experience, right? So, and that's why, like, without the eye consciousness, it won't work, right? A corpse doesn't see. But also without an eye sense, you could have a visible form and an eye consciousness, but if the person's eyes are impaired because of some kind of medical problem and they can't see temporarily, then they don't have a functioning eye sense power, so they can't see. So you need all 3 in order to see. And when those 3 come together, there's an experience of an eye consciousness experiencing an object, and there will be a feeling associated with that. Could be pleasant, could be unpleasant, it could be neutral. And then it's going through the same thing, right? The sound, an ear sense power, and ear consciousness, an odor, a nose, and sense power, and a nose consciousness, and so on, down to taste, and then tactile, right? The tactile object, a body sense power, and a body consciousness. And then the last one, because there are 6, right? Those are the 5 senses. And the last one would be the aggregation of a phenomenon, right? Meaning a mental phenomenon, a mental sense power, and a mental consciousness. And so that'd be the 6. So that's another way of categorizing feelings is, and again, why is this listed? You could notice these then in your experience, right? When are you experiencing a feeling associated with your mental consciousness? When is it associated with ear? When is it associated with nose? So you can start to notice that. What is my experience like? When is it associated with which consciousness? And it's a way of, and remember, like, I just want to remind people, that's why I mentioned this in our mindfulness, is in the 4 foundations of mindfulness, right? In the sutra, there's a teaching, right? The 4 foundations of mindfulness. We usually, oftentimes we stay with mindfulness of, oftentimes we'll just stay with mindfulness of bodily sensations, right? But there's a whole kind of mindfulness of feelings, right? And what they actually say in the commentaries is that mindfulness of feelings, because if you practice mindfulness of your feelings, you'll become much more aware of suffering, right? And of the nature of suffering and of how suffering arises. So it's a whole practice, actually. So actually, why are we studying this, by the way? There's a whole topic, right? Mindfulness of feelings, right? That's one of, actually, if you want to practice mindfulness, there are 4 foundations of mindfulness. One of them is mindfulness of feelings, right? But how do you be mindful of your feelings if you don't know what the feeling is, right? So I want to point that out. So we're learning this, right? Material. The purpose of learning this is then to be mindful of your feelings, right? To notice them and to say, well, what's my experience like of feeling? And how does that relate to my experience of suffering? And and oftentimes they say that in the commentary on the 4 foundations of mindfulness sutra, they say if you practice mindfulness of feelings, that will serve experientially for you, for us, for the practitioner, as a way of understanding among the 4 noble truths, the truth of the cause of suffering. So there's, if you start to watch your own feelings, you'll see how you give rise to your own experience of suffering. Experientially, it will no longer be intellectual, it'll be your own direct experience. So if you study this material well, then you start to notice, how am I relating to tongue feeling? How am I relating to sound feeling? Feeling related to consciousness of sound? How am I relating to feeling related to mental objects and so on? What the Buddha's teachings are saying is if you practice awareness and mindfulness of that, then you'll come to a deeper understanding of the cause of suffering for yourself in your own experience. So that, again, why are these being listed? They're tools for your own mindfulness practice. And then he says, those, now he's just getting numbers, right? You do math very easily. Further, those six are divided into three: pleasant, unpleasant, pleasant, suffering, or neutral. So if you take 6 times 3, it's 18. And then he says, fearing wordiness, if I were to describe in detail their individual identities, I will leave them out. Right. So he's saying, you can go on and on with enumerations, and that's not my point, is what he's saying. He's saying that's enough for you to practice mindfulness of these, right? For you to be aware of them in your own experience. I don't need to be wordy about it, is what Kachin Gyaltsen's saying. Then he says another, look at this time. Then he says, moreover, when feelings are divided by way of the object of abandonment and antidote, there are two: feelings that support adherence and feelings that support deliverance. So I'll read the description. He says, feelings that support adherence, or another way of saying, another translator called that longing. So feelings that support adherence or feelings that support longing are feelings concomitant with craving for the attributes of the desire realm. And then he says, feelings that support deliverance are, for example, feelings that are concomitant with the mental consciousness that, having turned away from attachment to the attributes of the desire realm, is included in the actual first concentration. And then he said, I'll just read this next part and then I'll explain it. Such twofold division of feelings is taught in order to make known the manner in which craving is induced through the force of feeling, the manner in which one can become free of attachment to feeling and dependence upon an actual concentration. So what is this last category getting at? And so first of all, to understand what he's getting at, you have to remember what we've talked about this before, but you have to remember what is he saying, what's the desire realm, right? So there are, in that sense, there, often as you'll hear in Buddhist scriptures mentioned, 3 realms, right? There's the desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm. And so we're in the desire realm, animals, humans, and so on, also according to Buddhism, hell beings, hungry ghosts, animals, humans, demigods, and some of the god beings are in the desire realm. So we human beings are in the desire realm. And so what he's getting at is, actually, and why is our realm that we share called the desire realm? Because desire is the main mental affliction. We mostly have desire. And actually, if you check your experience, you'll see that's true. Occasionally we have anger, right? But actually desire is more of the time, and desire is actually, oh my goodness, if you look around at our world, desire is very prominent, right? In ourselves and in others. So anyway, desire is the main thing in our realm. So when we adhere to or long for, right, feelings that connect to that, right? So actually, you could say, for the most part, all of our feelings as ordinary, if you're not doing deep meditative practice, all of our feelings are feelings that support adherence, that are concomitant with craving for attributes of desire realm. So like if you when we're hungry, when we're thirsty, when we want to be colder, when we want to be warmer, when we want to be, hear certain sounds, when we don't want to hear other sounds, when we want all of that, there is our whole lives. Most of our feelings are like that. Right? We want to stop this and go towards that, and we want to, have whatever. We want to get in the comfort of our bed, and then we were too long in bed, and we want to get up in the morning. All that is feelings that are concomitant with craving for attributes of desire. Right. So from the time you wake up in the morning, you want to stay in bed, but then you want to get up, and then you want to earn money, or maybe you have to go to work, or whatever it is. There's all kind, right? All of those are concomitant with desire. Right? It's all part of this realm. And then feelings that support deliverance from the desire realm. Here it's not deliverance. Here they're not particularly talking about liberation from samsara. They're talking about leaving. It could be that, but mainly it was talking about here is he mentions the first concentration. So that's the form realm. And so there comes a point actually where one turns away from attachment to the attributes of desire realm, right? And actually what happens, this is getting at, we're going to get into this more in discrimination, but I'll just mention it here. What this is getting at is this, is as you become more and more capable of meditation, of meditative absorption, it becomes more and more pleasant. The experience of meditation becomes more and more pleasant. And actually, that starts fairly early on. Like, in other words, if you meditate regularly, actually, I've noticed this just on a very mundane level, you have to meditate enough so that it becomes pleasant, or people don't stop. Sometimes people say, I meditated for a while, but I stopped. And we're desire realm beings. So I'm like, well, if the person stopped, usually it means they didn't do it enough to actually get the pleasant experience. So because we tend to do what we find pleasant. It's like, it's similar to somebody said, well, somebody says, I tried ice cream, but I didn't like it, so I stopped. Well, they don't like, it's like, well, they don't like ice cream. So, it's like, but if you actually meditate, there is actual experience of deep meditation is by its nature pleasant. It starts to become more and more pleasant. I mentioned this before. I was talking to I knew one monk friend of mine who was a very good meditator, and he said, if you study the 7 levels of approaching calm abiding, each one has its own level of pleasant experience. And he said, he made a point to me. He said, if you get to the 7th of the 9 levels of meditative, which is not yet calm abiding, he said, if you get to the 7th, it's more pleasant than anything you ordinarily experience. He said, so that changes things for you. You stop being as interested in sensory pleasures because the meditative experience is more pleasant than those. Before that, of course, sensory experiences are more, if you're not that, if we're at the 1st or 2nd or 3rd level, it starts to become, by the 3rd or 4th level, it starts to become pleasant, but it's still not more pleasant than sensory experience for us because we're not that good at meditating yet. But when you get to the 7th of the 9 levels, then the experience of the pleasure of meditation becomes more actually pleasurable experientially than the most pleasant sensory experiences. Then there's the 8th level and the 9th level. The 9th level is calm abiding. Is right before calm abiding actually, and then you achieve calm abiding, and then there comes a point where, and this is what this is getting at. Then there comes a point where you look at the feelings you have, and you're still in the desire realm. Right? So you're a desire realm being who's able to meditate that well, and you look at the feelings of pleasure associated with desire realm, and for you at that level, you say, oh, they're so gross. And you can actually see what the experience would be like of the first concentration, which is the first level of the form realm. And you start to recognize that's so much more pleasant than this. And so this is like, there's a discrimination that happens at that point, but this aggregate is the feeling, is you're noticing your feelings at this point. And it's associated, we'll get to it in the next section, but it's associated with a kind of discrimination where you recognize that feeling's better than this feeling, right? So you recognize the feelings experientially, and then you recognize that feeling is much more pleasant than this one. And so then that's part of the experience that allows you to, so there's a kind of, they call it special insight. There's a kind of special insight that happens that you can join with your concentration. And that special insight is an insight that understands this pleasant feeling is much worse than that one, and therefore your consciousness goes into that more subtle state. It's still feeling, right? You're looking for pleasure, but it's a more subtle pleasure. It's a more wonderful pleasure. And so there's a feeling aggregate or feeling mental factor associated with that kind of experience. And then, by the way, the same thing happens. Then if you're in the first concentration and you become interested, you can actually start to approach the second concentration, the second level of the form realm. And then you do the same thing. You have a kind of special insight associated with feeling where you notice, oh, this feeling is better than the desire realm, but it's not as good as the second concentration. And then you can transfer to that one. And you can do that all the way up through the 4 levels of the form realm. And then if you get to the top of the 4 levels of the form realm, the most pleasant of those, you can recognize the lowest of the formless realms is more pleasant than that. And you can keep going all the way up to what they call the peak of samsara, which is a very subtle mental concentration that we'll get to in the section on discrimination. It talks about it. But that's a kind of feeling associated. So some feelings are associated with going lower and some are going with higher. And one other point I'll make, just so you're aware of it, is human beings can achieve those concentrations. So you can actually experience those. And then there's also, you can get reborn there. which we don't want, actually, by the way. That's not our goal as Buddhist practitioners, but if you achieve those levels of concentration as a human being and you get attached to them, then when you die, you can get reborn there, which is actually not helpful to your liberation. That's not the goal in Buddhism, but it's possible to have that happen. So that's just the thing. And you see the point about feeling here, that you move up because and Buddhists do practice those, and bodhisattvas go through those different levels and overcome attachment to them. Actually, that's part of what a bodhisattva actually does, is they achieve those different levels of pleasurable concentration, and they overcome attachment to those states, and they come to understand them so they can benefit the beings who achieve them, and so on. So there are uses to that, but this is about the aggregate of feeling associated with those different states. And did somebody have a question just now? I kept going. Oh, was it you, Sujata? Yeah.
You just answered it, Lauren. Thank you. It's well, I mean, I think there's still some residual sort of like maybe fear in me about getting stuck in those pleasant states, right? And I mean, it's the same with a lot, like even like Dharma classes, or like as I age and I move further away sort of naturally from the sort of sensory things or the things of this world. And I'd rather be at a Dharma class than, out late with friends or whatever, right? It's starting, things are shifting in that way. There's an attachment to the pleasure of these experiences, like the mental pleasure of coming to your class, and then even in meditative stuff, slowly, my practice is improving, and I'm noticing attachment to the natural consequences of continued practice, and the physical feelings, and yeah, so I think my question is around how to not go down that road. And I think you answered it in part, like it's the desire to not leave other beings behind. It's, but yeah, sort of how to double down on that aspect of it, to not just have this be another sort of pleasure trip, another source of attachment. So I think that's sort of what I fear when I hear you talking about going up to these levels. I shouldn't have fear about these wonderful, progressions that the bodhisattvas are going through, but I do notice a fear in myself.
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, I think that makes sense. And I guess I'll just say a few quick points. I mean, one is, of course, if we have pleasure associated with meditation or with Dharma study, that's a good thing. There's because that, it's like, they say, right, Shantideva says, bodhisattvas go from pleasure to pleasure. So there is, bodhisattvas are blissful and joyful. So that's, they're not miserable. So that's one good thing. So I think this, so one point I would make is if we're finding pleasure in our Dharma study and our Dharma practice, that's a good sign that we're practicing correctly, actually, is one point. It should be joyful. That's what Shantideva says, but then you're making a valid point. And I guess I would say two things. One is, yeah, for bodhisattvas, it's their unbearable compassion, right? In other words, they wouldn't stay in those, they can achieve the most pleasant states of samsaric existence in the formless realms, but they have this absolute commitment, right? So the more we cultivate compassion, and especially laksam, like the unusual attitude of universal responsibility, then that will always bring us back, is one point. And the other is, which even that's unique to bodhisattvas, but also even individual liberation practitioners also cultivate an awareness that, because they also achieve some of those states, and they have to overcome the attachment to those states in order to become an arhat. Because that's one form of attachment that one could still have that would block a being from becoming an arhat. It could be attachment to some kind of meditative pleasure. And so that even the arhats have to grow. And one way also is to recognize renunciation, that even those states are, first of all, they don't allow you to benefit others infinitely because they're not enlightenment. But the other is that you yourself will still fall back and suffer. So recognizing also that it is pleasant, but it's not permanent. It's not a permanent liberation, and that that your seeds of mental afflictions will still be there. So it's like, it's like, actually, I something for myself, I sometimes think of the analogy, like, if you went to like the best resort in the world or something, whatever, which I'm not sure I would really enjoy it personally, but one is you're using up, one is like, if you really actually were enjoying it, right? One is the recognition, well, wait a second, I need to go back and help others. Like if you need a vacation, that's a good thing, but it's a vacation to then go back and help others. But the other is, it's like this point from the more individual, the individual liberation person's perspective, is actually, it's like you're using up your bank account and you can't stay there forever. So it's like these realms are a bit like that. You're thrown there by a kind of positive karma, of meditation. In this case, it's a karma of meditation, but it won't last. So also that's another reason to not get overly attached to them, is that they're still within samsara, and you'll still, and you'll fall back eventually anyway. So it's not, in that sense, it's not. So there's a personal reason also. And if we remember that, then it helps, I guess, with that.
Thank you.
Sure. And then he concludes the section on feeling by saying, therefore, if you wish to understand these modes precisely, you should carefully consult Abhidharma. So the upper and lower knowledges, meaning the compendium of knowledge and the treasury of knowledge. So those are the two Abhidharmas, right? The one by Vasubandhu and the one by his brother Asanga. And then he says, also, one should learn from the stages of the path to enlightenment, the Lamrim, how not to let the three, pleasant, suffering, and neutral feelings, become causes of the three poisons. And there, I'll just remind, you guys already know a lot of this, but I'll just remind us. So, so what he's getting at, right, is as you meditate on these points about feeling, he's saying, do meditate on them, right? And you can study more in the Abhidharma if you want to, and so on. The text translated into English if you want to study them. But then he's making a point, right, which is the Lamrim and also Lojong. I was thinking when I read that, I thought, also Lojong gets very into this, doesn't it? About this topic is, there is, if you think of the antidotes, right? Like, like in Buddhism, we talk about the antidotes to the mental afflictions. They're getting at this, right? In other words, that, so one point is we remember, right? One point from the Lamrim is we remember, well, the pleasant, unpleasant, neutral feelings are a result of our karma, right? If you remember that, then they stop being an obstacle as much, right? Because then, then when you have an unpleasant feeling, you're less likely to blame others. You're more like, or blame yourself. You're more likely to say, let me stop creating bad karma and purify. When you have a positive experience, you think, let me do more positive things. Let me practice love and compassion and generosity and ethics and so on. So one way of relating to feelings is what he implied earlier when he says Lamrim. That's from the Lamrim, right? Is to remember karma. And then there are others, right, which we'll get into as we go through the mental afflictions, right? Like that we'll get into those more with the mental afflictions. But each of the mental afflictions arises in connection. Most of them, well, they all arise in relation to feelings, and then we exaggerate things, right? And so there's a whole other kinds of practices from the Lamrim and Lojong, where we counteract our exaggerations. So like we think, we we don't recognize that the pleasant feeling is the result of karma. We project that it's caused by the object. Then we exaggerate the qualities of the object, right? And then when you're angry, you exaggerate the negative qualities of the object. When you're grasping, you exaggerate the positive qualities of the object. And so we'll get into those when we look at the specific mental afflictions. But if you, if you understand the Lamrim, then okay, when I'm having a pleasant feeling, first of all, it's a result of my karma. Therefore, my tendency to exaggerate the quality of the objects is an exaggeration. And let me remember that it's not real, and so, that, like, so if you think about when you're angry at somebody, you only see the unpleasant. And then if you remember what's positive about them, or if you remember, if you have empathy for them and their suffering, right, then that counteracts, it decreases in anger and so on. If you cultivate love for them, that's one of the main antidotes, right, then that counteracts the anger and so on. So there are many different ways of working with our feelings so that we can still have feelings, because these, feelings aren't emotions here, feeling pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. We still have those because they're going to keep happening as a result of our karma. You can't stop the process of feeling. They may be neutral, but they're going to arise. But you can relate to them in a way that doesn't compound your suffering. And do you see that point? I'll just make one last thing about that. Do you see the point there also? Because I just think it's funny, this part. Not funny, it's funny and also ironic and also tragic. Is when we suffer, right? When we give rise, when our experience that arises is a suffering feeling. Do you get how dangerous it is? Like the problem isn't that. That's the result of past karma, right? The problem is that so often we create the cause of more suffering. You know, like, so we suffer because of a previous karma, right? So a suffering feeling arises, and we don't think, you know, we don't discriminate, actually. In this case, discrimination would be positive, right? We don't discriminate. Oh, that's a result of karma. Let me do purification. Let me be glad. It's purifying. I'll move on and I'll practice love and I'll love myself and love all beings, you know, and that's how I want to relate to my suffering. And let me relate to my suffering by generating compassion for others who are suffering similarly. We're all in the same boat. I recognize my common humanity with the suffering of other beings and other common sentience, even because it's not just humans. And let me cultivate compassion for all beings who suffer. That's not what we usually do, right? Oftentimes, instead, we get upset, and then we get angry, and then we get, you know, and then we may get resentful, or we get whatever, and then we create negative karma, which compounds the suffering. So I'm just pointing out, that's the last, with regards to feeling, the last thing we want to do is relate to feeling in a way that compounds our own suffering. You know, and creates more suffering. So that's part of the point of this also. We just have a couple minutes left and we'll do the dedication. Any other questions? Because that's the end of the section on feeling. Then maybe I'll just say a quick word and then we'll do the dedication. I'm not going to go into it today because we'll do it next time, but I want to say a couple general comments. You know, we took a long time on feeling, and we're going to take a pretty long time on discrimination. Probably the whole next class will be on this. The next aggregate. I'm sorry, it is an aggregate, so I keep doing that. The next aggregate, which is also the next mental factor, is discrimination. So I want to just mention, so these first three, feeling, discrimination, and intention, is the third. We're going to spend longer on because they're extremely important, right? They're among the most important things, and by understanding them, you understand Buddhism better, much, you know, in a very profound way. Then we'll start to speed up. We'll go through the other mental factors more quickly, but we're not going to spend this long on all of them. But these are very, very important ones. So I'm spending more time on them. That's one point. And then, you know, so next time we'll go through the mental factor of discrimination and its categories, and then we'll go into detail also about intention, because intention is the essence of karma. You know, intention is what drives karma. In a way, it is karma. It's karma in the mind. So we'll go through those, you know, in more detail, and then we'll go a little more quickly through all the other, because, you know, there are 51. So we'll go a little more quickly then through the others, but we'll go into some detail because they're for practice. And I hope everybody's seeing how all of these, though, are for introspection. You know, they're for understanding your own experience. And that's, you know, and I said that in the very beginning. This is like, I view this text as like a field guide to the mind, right? You know, so that's the purpose of it, right? It's that you can look back and go, what am I doing? How am I relating to my own experience? You know, and then you look inside yourself, and that can be a meditation, or it can just be, you know, sitting there thinking, you know, and going, wow, what's going on? You know, and how am I relating to it? So, and I think we have class. Oops. Next, I think we have class next week. Yeah. So next week we have class, and we'll do then the discrimination probably, and maybe we'll start on intention. At minimum, we'll cover all of discrimination next time. And Damshu, next class is the one you're not here, so I'll start the Zoom session next time, because Damshu's going to be away. So, but it'll be like normal. I'll start the Zoom session early so that people can log in. But let's do our dedication. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side. So the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lauren.
See y'all.
Thank you, Lauren.
Good Good to see you.
Thank you so
Wonderful.
much,
Thank you so
Lord.
much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
See you next week.